Associate Professor of Communication, Chair of Gender, Sexuality, and Studies here at Lake Forest College. And I'm so thrilled that you all came here tonight. This lecture series is named the Ruth Winter Lecture Series. It's named after Ruth Winter, who when she was here at the college, she brought the likes of Martin Luther King Jr. to speak back in the 60s. We named it after to honor her, but also to remember the power of words. And what we do in the way to honor her is that we bring speakers that are engaged in their community, politically, culturally, and socially. Our speaker tonight, Rich Cohen, fits that bill. He also happens to be a childhood friend of mine. I've known Rich since we were in the 6th grade, just south of here in Glencoe. As a kid, he was a hilarious storyteller, and that really hasn't changed through his lifetime. I've had the pleasure of following him in print by reading his works. He is a contributing editor to The Rolling Stone and The Atlantic. He's written a memoir, a children's fiction book, and what he's really known for is nonfiction. His nonfiction material ranges from Jewish gangsters, the Rolling Stones, his family's infighting over Sweet and Low, and my beloved 85 Bears. I like reading his books. As a reader, I find that I just get pulled in and I don't emerge until I finish the book. As a scholar, I really appreciate how well researched his material is, the way he weaves together the history and the story, and he makes history personal. I personally appreciate him around the holiday season, because whenever Rich writes a book, it makes holiday shopping really easy, because everybody gets a copy of one of his books. It's nice to have this opportunity to thank you for that. Tonight we're especially lucky that he's decided to be here, because today is the day that his new book, The Chicago Cubs, A Story of a Curse, was just released. We're going to be selling them in the back if you're interested, so please make sure you get a copy of it. He's going to talk, he's going to read some of his book, and he's going to answer questions. So please join me in welcoming Rich Cohen.
So this book is actually completely connected to the 85 Bears book because in 1984 the Cubs came very close to killing me. I don't know if you ever saw the movie E.T., but when E.T. turns all gray and they zip E.T. up in a bag at some point in that movie, that's kind of what happened to me when the Cubs collapsed in 1984. And the 1985 Bears, brought me back to life. I always said the 85 Bears were penicillin for a Cubs fan. And, but I've always, the core of my, I think the reason I'm a writer really is because of the 84 Cubs. They gave me my tragic sense of the world. And, basically, the way it started for me, like Linda said, I grew up in Glencoe. We grew up in Glencoe. My parents are from Brooklyn. People used to ask me what my father did. I would say, for him, being from Brooklyn's pretty much a full-time job, because that's all I ever talked about. And he was a Yankees fan from Brooklyn, and he took me to a Cubs game in 1976. I was born in 68, so I was 8 years old. The Cubs played the Cincinnati Reds. The Cincinnati Reds were one of the greatest teams in history. They had Johnny Bench and Pete Rose and all those guys. And the Cubs were winning, and then all of a sudden the Cubs were losing. And then the game was over. It was a very typical Cubs fan experience. I saw my first heckler. I saw a drunk adult, which I'd never seen before. And I heard somebody Larry Bittner called the son of a bitch. And basically, on the way home from that game, driving down the Edens, my father sort of put his arm around me and said, I want you to make me a promise here today. It was very Godfather-like. I said, what? He said, I want you to promise me you will not become a Cubs fan. I said, why? He said, because a Cubs fan will have a bad life. He goes, look at me. I am a Yankees fan. I expect to win. A Cubs fan expects to lose. A Cubs fan has lower expectations, and as a result will accept less in life. A Cubs fan basically believes every human endeavor naturally ends in defeat and loss. So of course I became, a gigantic Cubs fan. It was the best way to rebel against my father. And the teams I grew up with were the teams of the 70s. And that's whatever happens when you're 10 is pretty much your template for the rest of your life. Everything's compared to it. So for me, everybody on the Cubs is compared to Bill Buckner, Dave Kingman, and Rick Russell. And Rick Monday. Those are my guys. And a thing for me was to be able to go. A great thing about the Cubs, why the Cubs, not the White Sox, for a lot of reasons. First of all, I realized you don't really get to choose anything. I'm friends with kids just because my parents chose to live on one street. I'm still stuck with those same kids. But the thing about the Cubs is they played in the day. So you'd come home from school, and they were on TV. And when I was a little older, you could get on the bus and go see the Cubs games. And that was like my first sense of freedom, was being able to go alone to Cubs games. So like Linda said, I was going to read a couple things. And this is actually the day the book was published, so it's all stuff I haven't really read before out loud. But anyway, this is about that. When I was 13, I began going to Cubs games on my own. This was my first taste of adulthood. I've associated Wrigley Field with freedom ever since. I'd catch the bus at the end of my street and ride it into Evanston, where I transferred to the L, the red line carrying me like a magic carpet above the rooftops all the way to West Addison Street, where it was ballpark ambiance and peanut shells the moment you stepped off the train. $5 got you into the bleachers. You followed ramps. Up top, you made a choice: left field bleachers or right field bleachers, like choosing a political party. Though you might have gone this way instead of that by whim, the decision became your destiny. I chose left field. Over time, I came to hate right field bleacher bums. I cursed them in chants that were never more elaborate than right field sucks. The left field bums were sunnier and saner than the bums in right, whom I feared. To this day, when almost every other distinction has been erased from my life, I still feel like I'm being disloyal if I sit in right field. For me, the seasons were defined by what was going on at Wrigley Field. Early spring meant bare ivy and players in long sleeves, a center fielder exhaling plumes. Late spring was new growth and freshly cut grass and hecklers, irrational hope, the queasy sound of a shattered bat. Summer was lush greenery, the rumble of a passing train, the trees along Waveland Avenue tossed by the wind and filling up like sails. And then the dog days of August when the ivy withered and the tree drifted to the bottom of the standings. Because the Cubs never made it to the postseason, autumn was storm shutters pulled over outfield gates. Best were weekday games that started at 1:05, games that had no meaning other than the meaning shared by every other unimportant thing. Seeing a game like that in the spring, and now I was older, 16, meant ditching school after fourth period, waiting for the bus on Green Bay Road, familiar faces in the bleachers, my baseball family. To sit out there when everyone else was in class, to see the players playing the game without any effort to schedule it for a time when most of the world could watch. Let me know that life was still going on even when I was trapped in school. One August, I took a picture. I was right behind the catcher, 5 rows up, using a disposable camera. I got the shot off a moment before an usher asked to see my ticket. I still have that picture. The pitcher, I think it's Rick Sutcliffe, but it's impossible to say, has just released the ball. His body is still falling toward the hitter, who is already swinging. You see the bend of the batter's back leg, his hips following his eyes toward the point of contact. You see the ball suspended between the pitcher and the hitter. The infielders are moving, anticipating. You can't see the sun, but it's there in the shadows. And you can't feel the wind, but it's there too in the flags on the poles and the wandering bits of trash. Nor can I be seen, though it's all through my eyes. And the summer is there, going full blast, as if it will never end. Okay, so this gets at a point that I realized when my father told me not to be a Cubs fan and that it would wreck my life, which is he was right, basically. And he was wrong, because I felt that like being a Cubs fan completely formed my sensibility. I always thought a Cubs fan was the natural occurring Buddhist of the national pastime, because a Cubs fan learns to live in the here and now. A Cubs fan can enjoy an August afternoon because a Cubs fan knows there's no October coming. Now, they won the World Series, so that changes everything, but the fact is my character has been formed. It's not really changing. Whenever the Cubs get in any trouble, I feel like I'm going to vomit. That hasn't changed. I have no confidence whatsoever in what's about to happen. So I felt like being a Cubs fan was somehow better than being the fan of other teams. You know, when you wore a Cubs hat, you were telling other people, my kingdom is not of this world, you know? My World Series is in some other heavenly realm that someday I will reach. The key apocalyptic event in my life, as I said, was the 1984 Chicago Cubs. I was sophomore in high school, and they put this team together that Harry Carey dubbed their infield the all-animal infield. That was Leon Bull Durham at first, Rhino, Sandberg at second, the Boa, Larry Boa at short, and the Penguin, Ron Say at third, and on every fourth or fifth day, Steve Trout on the mound. And Harry Carey said they were not only the best infield, he'd say this all the time, this is why Harry Carey was so great, he would say, the best looking infield. And he'd go through it. Leon Durham, classical good looks. Ryan Sandberg, who couldn't love a face like that? And I believed, like some other people in this room, that team could not be beaten, that was the greatest team in the history of baseball. In the middle of the season, they released a 45 record that I still have called Men in Blue, where they pretty much guaranteed they would win the World Series. And they cruised through the regular season, and they got to the playoffs. I got tickets to the first playoff game. I got to miss school. And I didn't even have to show a note. The teacher said a ticket stub was sufficient because it was such a big historic occasion. That was the 1984 NLCS. They played the first two games in Wrigley Field. They blew out the San Diego Padres in game one. They beat them 13-0. I think Bob Dernier led the game off with a home run. Rick Sutcliffe, their ace pitcher, hit a home run in the third inning using Ryan Sandberg's bat. Not only did I dislike the San Diego Padres, I thought they were evil because their ace pitcher was a guy named Eric Shao, who was a member of the John Birch Society. I thought he probably wouldn't like me very much if he met me. And my sister happened to be going to law school at the University of San Diego, and she was dating this guy named Jerry Schmelter, who was like a surf bum, great guy, bunch of surfer friends, but they were like Padre fanatics. And they were talking about the Padres all the time. And I so badly wanted the Cubs to destroy the Padres to stop Jerry from talking, you know. And it was very important to me that the Cubs win, not just historically, but for me, for my own sanity. And I don't know if you know what happened, but it was very, very bad. The Cubs, they went to San Diego. They only had to win 1 out of 3 games. They led in every game, and they lost every game dramatically and in some unbelievable, clear evidence of a curse fashion. I was going to read this part about what happened after that last game. I had been watching it, counting outs, man. I made the same mistake I made last year during the World Series, which is, I'm like, oh, we only need 6 more outs, 5 more outs. Never do that. Because as soon as you start doing that, something terrible happens. And I've been counting outs, and I was sitting on the couch, and it was bad. Okay. I was on the living room couch in Glencoe, surrounded by my family, but sitting in silence. A big thing was it was on national TV, but we turned the sound down because Harry Carey did the games on the radio on WGN and listened to his, which was fascinating because Harry Carey, what he was describing was almost never what was actually going on. It was unrelated. If I had helped the Cubs, okay, I was on the living room couch in Glencoe, surrounded by my family, but sitting in silence. If I had helped the Cubs win, it seemed I must now take some part of the blame for their loss. I had failed, but was not sure how. I knew only that I was still counting outs, but no longer wanted to get to 0. My father tried to console me, then gave up, saying, I told you not to follow this team. I told you what would happen. By the time the Cubs' last hitter came to the plate, Jody Davis, the catcher, who grounded out, the fans at Jack Murphy Stadium in San Diego were swinging stuffed Cubby Bears on nooses and chanting 40 more years, which, by the way, turns out to be pretty accurate. I was wild, looking everywhere for relief. I noticed my sister in the hallway on the phone. Is that him? I shouted. What's your problem? She said. I stormed over. If I had been in a bar, I would have insulted a man twice my size. I would have picked a fight I could not possibly win in hope that the beating I took would ease my pain. I ripped the phone out of her hand and shouted into the receiver, listen to me, Jerry, and listen good. I was 16 years old and heard something worse than laughter. A person trying to repress laughter. Muffle it, the son of a bitch. I could also hear the room behind him, cheers and backslaps. I could hear high fives. I could hear tops being popped off beer bottles. "Don't worry, pal," Jerry said. "You'll get him next year." "F next year," I said. "And F you too, Jerry." "What?" "Listen good," I said. "You are celebrating, but you should be mourning. Your team will be a poor representative of the National League. The Tigers will kill your team because your team sucks." "Hey, calm down." "You are celebrating," I said again, "but there's nothing to be happy about. The better team lost." Then I hung up. I really hung up, in the old emphatic exclamation point way. It's one of the big things we lost with the coming of the cell phone, the ability to make a point by slamming down the receiver. I ran out of the house seeing red, seeing jagged lines, flashing lights. I sat on the front steps and looked at the trees. The leaves were already turning yellow. Winter was coming. In the Chicago of my childhood, winter was endless and miserable. Less a season than a color, the gray of the slush that lined the roads. I cried, because all at once I realized that life is not fair, and that things do not work out, and that there might be justice in the world, but not for me. I became a man in that moment, cynical and experienced. When I went back into the house, I had the same name and clothes and parents, but was not the same person. I found out as I met Cubs fans as I got older that every Cubs fan, until probably last year, had that team that did that exact same thing to them, and that was the experience binding a lot of us together. And to me, I really do think it kind of made me a writer, because it was such an unbelievable thing to happen. And I'm not a sports writer. You heard the books that I write about. I've written a few books about sports, but I like to write about sports because of stuff like this. Because in sports, all the stuff that's normally hidden is out in the open and exposed, and you can see it, and it's on TV, and there's a camera on it. All the stuff you try to hide, how you act in really, really terrible moments. You're judged in some way by them, and there's great stuff to write about. So we were talking at dinner about Aroldis Chapman last year when I interviewed Theo Epstein for this book, and he said when he proved himself to him to be a great pitcher was when he came back in the 7th game of the World Series with nothing left and somehow got the team through that inning when he had nothing, not when he had everything, and all the momentum was against him. And I always remember this Ernest Hemingway quote where he said, "You never know how good a bullfighter is until after he's been gored." And it was like he'd been gored, very visibly, and then he had to stand out there and do that, and it was really an amazing, amazing thing. When I was a little bit older and I started writing for Harper's magazine, they said, "You can write about anything you want. What do you want? Is there any big question you want to write about, try to answer?" I said, "Yeah, I want to find out why the Cubs can't win the World Series." That was in 2000. And I went on the road with the Cubs for about 3 weeks, and they lost 7 games in a row. And let me tell you, if you're like a reporter and you have to go down to the clubhouse after the 7th straight loss and ask them what went wrong, there's nothing more horrible than that, And then I came back and I interviewed the general manager, who told me the reason the Cubs couldn't win was because of Wrigley Field. And he made a whole case about why Wrigley Field, and it's true that the Cubs were like the greatest team in baseball until they moved into Wrigley Field and then never won another World Series again until last year. The only team to win in Wrigley Field was the Bears in 1983. And there's a story to me that epitomized the fans' relationship to Wrigley Field in a way, which was, I don't know if you've ever heard this story, but when the Bears are playing in Wrigley Field, the end zones were foreshortened in one side by the brick wall, the right field wall. And the ball was handed to Bronco Nagurski, the great fullback, and he put his head down and went right through everybody and smashed head first into the brick wall. And he got kind of knocked silly, and George Halas said to him, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Yeah, but that last guy hit me really hard." And I sort of thought, well, yeah, that's what Wrigley Field's been doing to Cubs fans all these years. And I do think that that's a whole other story about what happened at Wrigley Field. But there reached a point after that trip and then the Bartman game, okay, the shame of the Bartman game, and the look on Dusty Baker's face when that team fell apart, and I understood exactly what he was thinking. I could read his mind. And what he was thinking was, oh my God, there really is a curse. And I thought, you know what? I was like 35 years old then? I'm like, I'm done. I quit. I can't do this anymore. It's been just too miserable. So I was going to just read about that moment where I quit the Cubs. And then I decided, screw it. I've been through Bartman, I've been through Sosa, I've been through 1993 and 1989 and 1984. I've been through Dave Kingman. I've been through everything and suffered heroically, and was in the exact same place I'd been when I started. But I was old now, with my own children. I did not want them to suffer as I had. When I thought of the Cubs, I said to myself, there is no one on this earth who was on this earth when the Cubs were champions. History had become too heavy. I wanted to live unencumbered, without the numbers and false hopes pressing in on me. I'm not sure of the exact day, but at some point I said to myself, I'm done. I stopped following the Cubs, then stopped caring. Buddhism for a Cubs fanatic. What causes suffering? Attachment to this team. What's the cure for that suffering? Give up that attachment. It was the only way off the wheel, the only way I could stop experiencing the same heartbreak again and again. I emptied myself of all desire for a championship, and it turned out to be the smartest thing I could have done, because it was only when I was empty of that desire that it could finally be fulfilled. So I can tell you the exact moment where I came back to the Cubs, and it was when I was working on the Bears book and I went to see Jim McMahon, the great Bears quarterback in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I banged on his door, and he took a long time to answer. And when he finally did, he was wearing a shirt that said, "Got milk," and underneath it said, "Got pot." And he had a huge thing of chewing tobacco in his mouth, and he grabbed me and he pulled me aside and said, "We're going to win the World Series." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because Theo is coming." And it was really Theo Epstein, I believe, right from the beginning, because I'd seen what he did with the Red Sox, and I understood all about the new statistics and the new baseball and the way he approached things. Because I believe that the curse, the Billy Goat curse, there really was a curse, but it wasn't a metaphysical curse. It was like a culture of defeat. And I saw it when I was with the Cubs, and it would sort of spread from player to player. And when things went wrong, they had a built-in excuse. You know, kind of, here we go again. And it just became the culture of the team. And the way Theo Epstein did it is, first of all, he got very young players. And young people are really good to break a curse because they're kind of stupid, okay? And they don't know about history, and that allows them to be free. They don't know about the curse. And two, what would happen in the past is they'd have young players, but they'd bring them into an existing team, and they'd learn from the older guys about the curse. So he had that team, he sort of raised them together like in a greenhouse in the minor leagues, and had them ascend together, and then brought them all up pretty much together. I mean, within 16 months, they all came up at the same time. And that, to me, is really how he did it. And you know, Theo Epstein's grandfather was a great screenwriter, and he wrote Casablanca and Arsenic and Old Lace. And I thought, this is the perfect guy, because what's the curse really? It's a story. It's a really terrible story. And how do you get rid of a really terrible story? You write a new story. And that's basically what he's done. And I was going to read this part about the really going up to the World Series, where I got to tell you that right when, there's a funny thing in here, because it's just a story that I was born in Lake Forest, okay, and I was totally into all the Chicago teams, and I always considered myself as being from Chicago, but I'm not really. I'm from Glencoe, and every now and then somebody would remind me that I wasn't really from Chicago. And I lived in Manhattan, in the West Village, when the World Trade Centers were knocked down, and I could see them from my window of my apartment. And it was horrible, and it was very crazy time. And maybe a week after, I'm walking through the West Village, and there's a Chicago cop directing traffic. You could just tell he had the coat, you know, he had a big mustache. It was a Chicago cop, middle of New York City. And I got so emotional. I went over and I said, thank you for, it's like, I need help and my city is coming to help me. And I thank him. And I go, it's because I'm from Chicago that I feel this way. And he goes, oh really, where in Chicago are you from? And I go, Glencoe. And he goes, that's not Chicago. But yet, when the Cubs got good, I didn't want to go to Glencoe, I wanted to go to Chicago, and that's where I went. So I was aware that when the Cubs won the World Series, some huge part of my identity had been changed. You know, being a Cubs fan meant my kingdom is not of this world. You know, it meant not winning. It meant being on a road trip that never reaches a conclusion. You know, and you're motivated by that thing. And as the '85 Bears taught us, one of the most disastrous things that can happen to a team is to win. You know, because you lose your sense of mission. And that hit me after they won Game 6. I was there in the press box, and I was going to read that because it was like an epiphany to me. I came out of this is after Game 6 last year in Cleveland. I came out of the press box as if I'd been shot from a cannon. I went everywhere and high-fived everyone, then headed back to my hotel. It had been warm in the middle innings, but at some point a cold front blew in. Dark clouds, lashing rain. It came on so fast. I zipped up my coat and hugged myself, and that's when it hit me. What if the Cubs win? Losing would be easy. I'd spent my whole life losing. But what would winning mean? Being for the Cubs had always seemed special. We were different from other fans. The curse and the years of futility had given us a unique role. We were emissaries from a higher realm, warning of hubris and vanity. We were holier, better, pure. We knew life was more than pennants and percentages. Wearing a Yankees hat meant corporate excellence. Wearing a Mets hat meant miracles. But wearing a Cubs hat meant loving the game on its most humdrum afternoon. September 13th, 1979, 14 games out of first place. Larry Bittner driving Ivan DeJesus into score. Would we lose that? Would being a Cubs fan become ordinary? There'd be the initial euphoria, of course, the party, and the glow that would linger as long as the core of this particular team survived. But after a while, these players would age and give way to others, and the fans who are young would become old, and those who are being born would grow up in a strange world with the fantastical belief that the Cubs are a really good baseball team. Being a Cubs fan would become just like everything else. There's only one solution, I decided. If the Cubs win the World Series, the playing of the sport must be discontinued. The leagues must be disbanded and the players sent home, the stadiums destroyed. Professional baseball really began with the team that became the Cubs. Early in the 20th century, that team won and won and won, and then, for whatever reason, stopped winning. They set off on a 108-year trek through the wilderness, plumbed the depths of defeat, then somehow found their way back. 2016 was 1908 all over again. The historic arc of the game could finally be recognized. It's a story that begins and ends in Chicago. If they won Game 7, that story would reach its obvious conclusion. Disband and go home. Anything beyond this point is postscript. Obviously, they didn't listen to me. They're still playing. That's just a sense of this story in this book, and it'd be good if people had questions and I could talk more that way. I can talk on any topic.
He will answer any question. He just offered it. Come on. Somebody's got questions.
Have you been to Wrigley Field since they built up the surrounding neighborhood? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I have. I spent a lot of time there in the last couple of years. And honestly, I was always a real purist about Wrigley Field in the neighborhood. And it's interesting because it is just about the Cubs, but it's not just about the Cubs. It's like about culture and what could happen, and you kind of become a little bit too attached to a tradition and the way things are, and it becomes almost kind of crippling. And when I went there and really studied Cubs history, because this is the whole story of the Cubs history, because the Cubs are the first professional sports team really in this country. And the Cubs started with such ideas of invention, and they moved from park to park to park. And when William Wrigley took over, he tried stuff all the time. And Bill Veeck, who worked for the Cubs first and then the White Sox, did crazy stuff just because it was fun. And by the time I was a kid, it became like the Western Wall in Jerusalem. I mean, you couldn't touch a stone or people would go crazy. And the idea of lights was like, and I was one of those people. who basically thought there should never be night games in Wrigley Field. And when I saw Ricketts, I thought, wow, this is how it must have been in 1920, when people were actually like, I'm just going to do a bunch of stuff, and some of it will work and some of it wouldn't. And I think it's really good, because I think that for a long time, it's one of the reasons the Cubs didn't win. The whole thing became kind of a museum, And across town, the White Sox were doing things that were completely idiotic, and we made fun of them, but they formed some of my favorite memories, like blowing up all those disco records and wearing shorts, and the Oakland A's with the yellow ball and everything. So I think when it becomes too much like a museum to its own history, it starts to die, and I think the team's really alive in a way it's never been in my lifetime.
Did I hear correctly that the lack of lights affected the 84 playoffs, or the sequence of games?
Well, I don't know. I thought it had. Okay, the suggestion somebody made to me was, because then the NLCS was 5 games. There was only one round before the World Series, okay? And it was a best-of-5 series, and the Cubs had home field advantage. So maybe it was supposed to be that the Cubs are supposed to get the last 3 games. But what is true, what I do know is that if the Cubs made it to the World Series, what they were saying is they were going to ask the Cubs to play their home games at Comiskey Park, because the baseball didn't want to lose the revenue of having the TV commercials on at night. So that didn't happen, but the lights became important for that reason, but also because, one of the big mysteries is the 69 Cubs. Like, why did they collapse the way that they did? Now, I grew up in the ruins of the 69 Cubs and didn't even know it. I always compare myself to somebody that grew up like in the provinces of Rome during the Middle Ages. Like, I didn't know there was a great kingdom here once, but every now and then I'd go digging in my garden to come up with like a bust of like Caesar or something, Those people were still around, and that team, when you go back and look at the 84 team, for all my love of the team, it wasn't that great of a team, and they had a great season. The 69 Cubs really were a great team, and they led the entire season right up until the very end when they collapsed. They really collapsed, like a country can collapse, or, they just went down. And I think they were leading by 7 games, like with less than a month left. And one of the reasons given was because of the lights, because they had to play all those games in August in the sun, and it exhausted their players, so when you got to the stretch, they had nothing left. The better explanation that I've heard is that it was the lights, but it wasn't because of the sun. It was because they were free every night to go out drinking. And players in other teams, they'd finish their game at 11 o'clock, they'd have to go to the hotel and go to sleep. The Cubs players would go across the street into the bars and drink, and that became a real factor. And you really saw it with guys like Joe Pepitone, who came to the Cubs later, who were like very much out and about in the Playboy Club, dancing. So the lights definitely gave the whole feeling more of a 16-inch men's softball league sometimes than of an actual pro baseball team.
You give Epstein a lot of credit. How much did he consciously try to change the narrative of failure the way you described? Did he actually admit that was...
Well, he wouldn't say it was like when I talked about the bar, I said, well, what did you know about the curse coming in? Now remember, he dealt with the curse in Boston. But I always said the Boston curse is nothing compared to the Cubs curse. The last year the Red Sox won the World Series before he took over? Do you know? I think it was 1918, which is pretty long. But you know who they beat? The Cubs. And the pitcher that beat the Cubs was Babe Ruth. That's how long ago it was. So he was aware and familiar with the Boston curse. He grew up with it. And he grew up within, a couple blocks from Fenway Park, or like half a mile. So he said he first really became aware of it during the Bartman game. He was running the Red Sox, and he was in New York waiting to play the Yankees, and he watched it on TV. And he said to him, it just seemed like a blown lead. That's how he saw it, But then he realized that there was something else going on, and he wouldn't say it was a curse, but he would say that the culture of the team was kind of rotten. He might not use the word rotten, but there was this, it was like the Chicago Bears were before Mike Ditka came. I interviewed Doug Plank, I used some of his words in this book, who was a great Chicago Bear, and he said there's 3 kinds of coaches. There's the aspirin coach, the penicillin coach, and the chemo coach. And the aspirin coach just masks things, doesn't fix anything. The penicillin coach fixes everything but the one thing that can't be fixed by penicillin, and that's cancer. And for that, you need the chemo coach. And that's what Theo Epstein realized. And when he first was interviewed by Ricketts, he said, basically, how bad are you willing to get this team to get? Because this team's got to become incredibly bad. And when I talked to him, he said he thought the reason why they couldn't win is they were always going to maybe be up for sale, and they were always going to be on WGN TV. So they had to be decent to at least put on TV and to sell. And that made them, that was so they could never do sort of the gut renovation that he felt that they had to do. And when I was a kid, the guy they brought in was Dallas Green. And we went to high school with Dallas Green's son. And Dallas Green said the same thing. He said, it's the culture, you know? But the fans really didn't like it. So when Dallas Green traded Bill Buckner, it upset a lot of people, you know? And what Theo Epstein in Boston had traded Nomar Garcia-Parra or let him go, and that told you he was like Kaiser Sose, man. That guy would do anything. I mean, you get rid of, like, that's like trading Ernie Banks for the Red Sox. So I think he was very much aware of it, but in a very analytical, here's a company that I have to turn around, and it's got this bad culture where they always fall back on this narrative, and we need to change that. And I think he did it in a real methodical way.
So Theo's done a good job, obviously, in turning around the team. You write about the Bears. My question is there an NFL equivalent of Theo?
Huh.
Because he needs some help.
Well, the Bears had him. It was Jim Finks, I think, who was the guy who drafted all those players that made the Bears great. And then you had Mike Ditka, who was the example of what Doug Plank would call a chemo coach. He said the problem with the chemo coach is after they've killed all the healthy tissue, they keep using their chemo machine because that's all they got, you know, and they end up killing healthy tissue. So as far as turning the Bears around goes, I have no idea. I haven't really, I mean, it's crazy to me, the number of coaches they've been through and the way they draft, and I don't understand it at all. I think the best thing for the Bears maybe would be Theo, you know? I mean, they had Jim Finks put together that Bears team, and he was the president of the Cubs in '84, and then he went down to the Saints and made that team good. So there was a guy that went from sport to sport, because it's not, it's what Theo did was he's not like he can see baseball players other people can't. He obviously cannot. But he understood that it was the organization, that the organization was broken, and you had to fix the organization before you worried about what was going on the field, and you had to let the field go totally to hell. And I just don't see the Bears doing that at all. So you're on your own, I would say, with your team.
How much do you think past ownership of the Cubs was responsible for all of their losing seasons?
Well, I think it was hugely responsible. I mean, the team was good when William Wrigley, who started the gum company, was the president. He gave it to his son. His son, who owned the Cubs, when asked what his favorite sport was, said craps. Now, I don't really think of craps as a sport. I mean, but, you know, he said he didn't like baseball. He didn't go to Wrigley Field for 20 years before he died. And he didn't set up a farm system, which they paid for years and years because he didn't want to waste money. And he was very slow on getting black players that could have made that team great immediately. And he made this Faustian bargain very openly, where he basically acknowledged the team isn't going to be good. So we have to give people a reason to come out. So we're going to make Wrigley Field such a great place to see a baseball game that they'll come out win or lose. And that's when they planted the ivy, and that's when they started having this idea of Wrigley Field as this gem. And I remember, like, when that period when I quit the Cubs, I ran into a friend of mine, John Lippitz, kid we grew up with, and he knew I'd moved to New York. And we were talking about baseball, and he said, I hate New York. I hate Yankee Stadium. It's so ugly, and Wrigley Field's so beautiful. And I'm like, but here's the thing, like, whatever you think of Yankee Stadium, unsightly as you might think it is, all those World Series make it beautiful. And Wrigley Field, as beautiful it is, all that losing makes it kind of hard to be in sometimes, you know. That's how it could come to feel. So I do think it was Phil Wrigley. And then you went to WGN, who right at the beginning made a bunch of good moves. Most importantly, they hired Harry Carey, I think. But they brought in Dallas Green, but then they really just sort of let it deadhead, you know. And Theo Epstein's analysis is that they just wanted the team to be good enough to put on TV and to put up for sale if they had to. And then when Ricketts came in, it just shows you with somebody who's really motivated. And Ricketts told me actually that if the Cubs had won the World Series, he might not have bought the team, you know. He wanted to be the guy who broke the curse. That was the reason why he bought the team. So that's what he came in with the idea of, not like sometime in the future, or maybe we'll be good, or maybe we'll finish 5 games before 500, which is what they said every time I was a kid. He came in with the idea that we're going to win the World Series, and I'm going to go find the guy who can help me win it. And, you know, it just shows you when you have a motivated ownership, you can make a lot of progress very fast. Any other questions about Lake Forest or the lakefront, or how to start a fire with just a few sticks and not any matches?
That's the second one. New York is a global city, lots of passionate sports fans. Chicago, same thing. Is the culture around professional sports similar in New York and Chicago, or do you see any difference?
Well, I live outside of New York, and I'm trapped listening to New York sports radio every time I drive. And let me tell you, when the Cubs were swept by the Mets, in 2015, you did not want to be a Cubs fan living anywhere near New York. I think that it is pretty much the same. I find that Cubs fans are much better fans. In my opinion, they're not nearly, I shouldn't even be saying this, but my brother-in-law is a Mets fan, and he was at a bar, and Derek Jeter happens to stand next to him. He turns to him and yells right in his face, "You suck! You suck!" Now, Derek Jeter obviously doesn't suck. I mean, you know, so I've never felt that in Chicago. And actually, Jerry Schmelter, okay, who I read about, who, you know, we had that fight, but then he came to Chicago over the summer. We played a lot of wiffle ball together. We became very close. And I took him to a Cubs game, and we saw Billy Hatcher hit for the cycle. Now, my sister and him broke up. I hadn't talked to him in years. I wrote him about this, and because this is exactly what you're asking about, if I could find it. All right? Well, give me one more second. Okay. He said, this is about Cubs fans. I'm not positive. Okay. I remember 2 things about that game that I still talk about to this day. This is when I took him to see the Cubs play the Cardinals at Wrigley Field. I'm not positive they both happened that game or on later trips to Wrigley, but my memory, they both happened that day, and that they were why I consider Cubs fans the best and most sophisticated fans in the world. This is a Padres fan. First, the fans cheered loudly when Sarge Matthews hit the cutoff man on a single to left with a runner on first. He didn't get anybody out. He just held the runner. You had to explain to me why they were cheering, because I couldn't believe it. Most fans in most places would never notice a little smart baseball play like that. In Chicago, they cheered like he just hit one out. Second, when we were waiting for the train after the game, some idiots threw a young kid's Cardinals hat onto the tracks, and a couple of large guys who looked like Ditka fans from the SNL sketch made the culprits go down onto the track and give the kid's hat back and apologize. That has been my memory of Cubs fans ever since. All right, so if you buy this book, my kids will go to college. If not, I'm just hoping they're talented magicians and jugglers and stuff. Thank you.